Hey strangers, sorry it's been so long since I've had a chance to talk to you all, which some of you might think is a good thing, so not everyone has missed me. But anyway, today we have a great topic to talk about. We are going to talk about the Antichrist. Ooh, scary. And we're going to be taking two different looks at it, or kind of maybe criticizing one view or looking at it from a different angle. So if you have always thought that the Antichrist is this big scary guy that's coming sometime in the near future and he's going to usher in this apocalypse that's going to result in the end of the world, well, maybe that's true, or maybe it's not. Maybe you don't have to worry about this Antichrist coming in the future. And maybe a lot of the things you've learned about it are really just a lot of speculation and conjecture. So let's take a look at it. Let's see what Dr. David Jeremiah thinks about the Antichrist. I'm calling him doctor because I got chastised in the comments by someone saying I'm not respecting him because I was calling him David Jeremiah. I mean, it just takes a long time to say Dr. David Jeremiah. And to be truthful, I'm just not impressed necessarily by a bunch of letters behind people's names. It doesn't mean I think less or more of them. It's just not significant to me. I mean, Jesus didn't have a bunch of, it wasn't like Dr. Jesus, right? So the apostles, they were fishermen, so, or tax collector. So yeah, I'm not trying to be disrespectful, but I don't think it's necessary. We're going to be examining his position, and if his position is scriptural, then it will be able to be supported by scripture, and it won't need to be bolstered by a bunch of credentials. So anyway, I don't know, kind of off topic rant there, but okay. So we are going through Dr. David Jeremiah's book, What in the World is Going On? And we have gotten to chapter 7, titled When One Man Rules the World. So this one man that Dr. Jeremiah says is going to rule the world is the Antichrist, according to him. And he starts off by saying, let's see, he will emerge, this Antichrist is going to emerge out of, this is a quote, out of the newly formed European Union. Well, this book was published in 2008, so it's not newly formed anymore, but it was at that time, and is commonly referred to in the Bible as the Antichrist. So a leader emerging from the European Union, which, you know, is funny because he sees this as a 10-nation coalition because the Bible mentions something about 10 heads. And so he thinks the European Union apparently is made up of only 10 nations, but actually I think it has like in the 20s right now. I don't know. They come and go. But anyway, let's move on. So he does say something I agree with here, that the word Antichrist has a lot of misunderstandings, confusion wrapped into it, he says, about who he is and when he will appear and what powers he can exercise over God's people. True, I agree. There's a lot of misunderstandings. So he's going to clear it up for us. He does mention that the word Antichrist is only used 4 times in the Bible, and none of those times are in the book of Revelation. I don't know if that was surprising to you. I guess when I realized it, I was kind of surprised by that too. And that was something that came up in my book club recently. One of the ladies just was certain that the word Antichrist was in Revelation, but we have been programmed to think that, but not true. So let's let's just read the 4 occurrences of the word Antichrist from the Bible, because shouldn't that be where we're getting our information from anyway? So the first one is 1 John 2:18. Okay, children, it is the last hour. Now I'm going to stop you right there, because the funny thing about this is that Dr. Jeremiah did not actually quote that verse. So he has a whole 20 some odd page chapter on the Antichrist and explaining how he's going to come from the European Union and all these different things, but he didn't even quote the verse or verses, the 4 verses that mention the Antichrist. I wonder if it's because it's kind of hard to explain some of this. It's children, it is the last hour. This was written 2,000 years ago, remember? And as you have heard that the Antichrist is coming, so now many Antichrists have come. Therefore, we know it is the last hour. So that's a little confusing, isn't it, from a futurist perspective? John said it was the last hour. Remember in Matthew 24, when Jesus said, no one knows the day or the hour except my Father in heaven, not even the Son, but only the Father. So Jesus said nobody knew the day or the hour. And here's John saying that it is the last hour. Many antichrists have come, and therefore we know it is the last hour. So we only have 2 options here, at least as far as I can see it. Correct me if I'm wrong. Either John is a liar and a false prophet, and we need to remove 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John from our Bibles, or he was right and he knew that it was the last hour, and this had been revealed to them after Jesus spoke the words saying that no one knew the day or the hour. But there had been continuing revelation, and now John was able to say it was the last hour. Maybe John had seen some of those signs that Jesus had mentioned in Matthew 24. So, but there's a reason that Dr. Jeremiah doesn't want to mention that, because from this verse alone, we would have to think that this Antichrist was already present in the world 2,000 years ago. So unless he's over 2,000 years old, then we've missed something. So, but let's continue on. There's other verses. It's also in verse 22. Verse 22. Who is the liar but he who denies that Jesus is the Christ? This is the Antichrist, he who denies the Father and the Son. So who is the Antichrist? Someone who denies the Father and the Son, which, I mean, people have been doing that for 2,000 years. So I guess if we just looked at that verse, we could place this mysterious Antichrist either in our past, our present, or our future. But in conjunction with children, it is the last hour. Many antichrists have come, therefore we know it is the last hour. I don't know. Okay, chapter 4, verse 3, 1 John 4, verse 3. And every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. Wow. I mean, isn't that surprising? Did you know that? Is this new to you? I know there was a time when it was definitely new to me. I mean, let's just read that again, because it's kind of earth-shaking here. Every spirit that does not confess Jesus is not from God. This is the spirit of the Antichrist, which you heard was coming and now is in the world already. So, John wrote this 2,000-ish years ago, and he told the people who he wrote to 2,000-ish years ago that the spirit of the Antichrist is now in the world already, 2,000 years ago. So it does beg the question, why are we trying to place the Antichrist in our future if John seems to be placing it in the past? Maybe we're missing something. We'll keep looking. 2 John 7. This is the last mention of Antichrist. For many deceivers have gone out into the world, those who do not confess the coming of Jesus Christ in the flesh. Such a one is the deceiver and the Antichrist. Okay, so this is consistent with what John said in 1 John. What is the Antichrist? It is someone who denies Christ coming in the flesh, denies that Jesus, this is my interpretation of it, was the Messiah that had been prophesied. Could this have happened in John's day? Or is this Antichrist 2,000 years old right now? I don't know. Let's keep looking, because maybe Dr. Jeremiah has some information that will shed more light on it. Okay, so he says, even though the Antichrist is identified by that name only 4 times in the Bible, he appears many more times under various aliases. So let's look at some of these other places where the Bible mentions the Antichrist, although he may use a different name. So he talks about in Daniel 9, he's called the Prince who is to come. Now, I don't know if that is a reference to this Antichrist. Maybe it could be. But one thing to keep in mind about Daniel chapter 9 is that Daniel chapter 9 is a prophecy of what was to happen, and there is a time limit placed on it. It says 70 weeks are determined, 77s, 490 years were determined. So whatever or whoever this prince is to come, whether he's the Antichrist or not, it had to occur within the 490 years. And at this point, we are way, 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 way beyond that. So I would argue that the prince who is to come already came, unless I think what David Jeremiah would do would be to put a big gap in there, and that would make me say, what in the text do you see that demands a gap or calls for a gap? There's no gap in the text, but we place it in there because we don't like where it leads us if we don't. So, okay, then he talks about the Antichrist is the fierce king of Daniel chapter 8. Okay, yet again, Daniel chapter 8, this king that he's referring to comes at the latter end of the kingdom of Greece. So at the end of the 3rd kingdom. So we had Babylon, then the Medes and the Persians, then Greece, then this fierce king. So yet again, we would have to put a 2,000-year gap and say it still hasn't happened yet. Babylon was succeeded by the Medes and the Persians, and the Medes and the Persians were succeeded by Greece with no gap. But suddenly we're going to put a big gap in there to make the fierce king be the Antichrist who's in our future. Then he calls him the master of intrigue. Okay, also from Daniel 8, so we run into the same problem. A despicable man. This is from Daniel chapter 11. But Daniel chapter 11 and chapter 12 are all about the time when the power of the holy people comes to an end. So who are the holy people? Well, the holy people holy means set apart. So who were these set apart people? Obviously, they were the Jews, and they were set apart because they had a special covenant with God. But I would argue that in 70 AD, that covenant was ended, and it was replaced with well, I don't know if replaced is the right word. Then people accuse you of being a replacement theologist or something. But the old covenant did end. I mean, I don't think there's anyone who wants to say that we are still living under the old covenant. We have a new and better covenant. That's according to the New Testament. So this power of the holy people was the Jews' covenant with Yahweh, and that was represented by their temple. This is what gave them their power, because it represented their relationship with God. But that came to an end in 70 AD when their temple was destroyed. No more animal sacrifices, no more priesthood, no more Jews, actually, if you really want to think about it, because all their genealogies were burned. So, no way to prove you're a Jew. There's no Levites, no people that can say they are from the tribe of Dan or Judah. That all ended. So, okay, moving on. He equates the Antichrist with the one who brings destruction, the lawless one, the evil man. These are all from 2 Thessalonians. But the problem with 2 Thessalonians is, remember, it says, in speaking of this lawless one, who Dr. Jeremiah says is the Antichrist, Paul says, you know what is restraining him now. So Paul, writing to the Thessalonians who lived in the first century, said to them, you, Thessalonians of the first century, know what is restraining him, this lawless one, right now, 2,000 years ago. So yet again, this is all a first century context, and I don't see any possible way we can rip this out of the first century and try to place it in our future. There's just no reason to do that. At least he hasn't given it yet. And then he mentions that the Antichrist is the beast of Revelation from Revelation chapter 13. This is really interesting because the beast is not a person in Revelation. And, correct me if I'm wrong here. You can research this on your own, but the beast is a kingdom, not a person. Remember, there were 4 beasts in the book of Daniel. In Daniel chapter 7, there was a lion that represented Babylon. There was the second beast was a bear. It represented the Medes and the Persians. The third beast was a leopard, and it represented the kingdom of Greece. And then we have the 4th beast. I'm not even going to try to tell you who that is, but whatever it is, it's a kingdom, not a person, unless we're going to be completely inconsistent. And it also says in Revelation 13 that the beast has, I believe it's 10 heads and 7 horns. So if the beast is a person, now you have a 10-headed person with 7 horns. So I'm not sure what kind of person that's going to be. But no, this is a kingdom, not a person. So sorry, Dr. Jeremiah, I disagree with you there. Okay, now he's going to get into identifying the Antichrist due to 666, his special number. And I'm going to read you a little quote. He says, I have a pamphlet in my file called The Beast, the False Prophet, and Hitler. It was published in 1941, the year I was born. This pamphlet presented the formula for identifying Hitler as the Antichrist by showing how the letters in the word Hitler link him numerologically with the number of the beast given in Revelation 13. Okay, first of all, we've established that the Antichrist is not the same thing as the beast. The beast is a kingdom. So I don't know why he's referring to this again, but he himself says that he he doesn't agree with that. Obviously, Hitler wasn't the Antichrist, because the Antichrist, according to David Jeremiah, is going to come after the rapture. And since we haven't all been raptured, then the Antichrist hasn't come yet. This is his thinking, not my thinking. So 666 cannot be representative of Hitler as the Antichrist. So he goes on to say, who is the Antichrist? You must play by these 3 rules. And he's mocking here because he realizes that many people have been wrong about trying to use this gematria, this where we take letters and assign them a numerical value and try to get it to add up to 666. He says, you must follow the 3 rules. If the proper name does not reach the necessary total, add a title. If the sum cannot be found in English, try Hebrew, Greek, or Latin. Don't be too particular about the spelling. So I actually agree with him there. We get ourselves all worked up and try to figure out this puzzle. My husband's into Sudoku right now. He's been doing a lot of that. I feel like that's what we do with this 666. It's like this puzzle we're all trying to figure out. But he says, don't be too particular about the spelling. And above all, be persistent. If you keep working on it, you can make anybody the Antichrist. Which does seem to be true. There's been so many different people. You know, it's like the Pope, Nero, Hitler, JFK. I think he mentions that in the book. Oh yeah, here it is. President John F. Kennedy. What signs pointed to him? He went through a death and resurrection as a PT boat commander in the South Pacific during World War II. At the Democratic Convention in 1956, he received 666 votes. He was elected president and shot through the head, which is what the Bible says will happen to this future dictator. Okay. I thought that was kind of funny. The Bible doesn't predict that the future dictator will be shot through the head. It does say in Revelation 13 that the beast had 10 heads, 7 horns, and one of the heads seemed to have a mortal wound, but the mortal wound was healed. That's a little different than saying that a future dictator will be shot in the head. But anyway, so he says there were some that expected President Kennedy to come out of his casket and assert himself as the ruler of the world because they believed that he was the 666. So, okay, Dr. Jeremiah and I agree that maybe we can all be wrong, but nobody's been right. He says these people who are making predictions about the Antichrist will continue to fail. I agree. He says the Bible does not tell us who the Antichrist will be. And then he says, if you're here when the Antichrist is here, it means you've been left behind because you should have been raptured and you've missed the rapture, so you've been left behind. I mean, you have to ask yourself, John mentions Antichrist 4 times. Paul mentions this lawless one, and Jesus gave all these signs of his coming. I mean, if we weren't going to be here for any of this, why give all the signs? Why is David Jeremiah giving us this whole huge chapter on the Antichrist if none of us are going to be here, in his opinion, anyway? Why would we even need to know? I'm not sure. Okay, but he's going to tell us about the personality of the coming leader. He will speak pompous words against the Most High. This is from Daniel chapter 7. Remember, Daniel chapter 7 and chapter 8 all deal with the 4th kingdom, the beast that comes after the 3rd kingdom, which was Greece. So remember, that happened 2,000 years ago. Greece ended 2,000 years ago. And then there was a kingdom that arose after Greece. I'll let you take your pick here. There's 2 options. You can pick Rome, which is, I would say, the favorite pick for the kingdom that comes after Greece, or a lesser known kingdom that came actually more immediately after the kingdom of Greece is the nation of Israel itself. They became an independent kingdom ruled by the Hasmoneans. It was the Hasmonean dynasty. So if we're going to look for a kingdom from Daniel that comes after Greece, I don't see the European Union as being a potential, but that's what he says. And he says, the one arising from this kingdom will speak pompous words against the Most High. I'll touch more on that later, and I'll give you my thoughts on who that was, not is in our future, but was in our past. He also says that this person is going to be very cruel and will persecute or wear out the saints. And he's quoting Daniel chapter 7 here. And he does something really, I feel like he really misses a big major link here. He's quoting Daniel 7:25, and he says, in Daniel 7:25, the word persecute literally means to wear out. The same word is used to describe the wearing out of garments. So in Daniel chapter 7, it says this person is going to wear out the saints, just like you would wear out a garment. And then that's where he stops. He just says it's going to be a slow, painful wearing down of the people of God. I'm thinking, what if we looked at the New Testament and we thought about some verses that talk about this same wearing out? So I want to look at Hebrews chapter 8. You probably all know where I'm going with this, but I thought I marked it, but maybe I didn't. No, I guess I didn't. Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. So just a little backstory here. He's quoting Jeremiah and talking about the new covenant. And then in verse 13, he says, in speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete. And what is growing obsolete or becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So what is this thing that was growing old, becoming obsolete, wearing out? It was the old covenant. In fact, if we go back to Hebrews chapter 1, it says, you, Lord, laid the foundation of the earth in the beginning, and the heavens are the work of your hands. They will perish, but you remain. They will wear out like a garment. Like a robe, you will roll them up. Like a garment, you will be changed. It's the same idea, this wearing out. It's the same growing old of the garment that's mentioned in Hebrews chapter 8, verse 13. He's making the old covenant obsolete. What is growing old? What was growing old? The old covenant. It's ready to vanish away. I just, so when Daniel talks about wearing out, why don't we think about the wearing out of the old covenant that's talked about in the New Testament? And in fact, let's look at James. Oh, I like this one. James chapter 5, verse 1. I probably don't even need to look it up. He says, come now, you rich, weep and howl for the miseries that are coming upon you. Your riches have rotted and your garments are moth-eaten. I used to just think that, I don't know who I thought James was talking to here, like the rich people across all of humanity since James wrote this 2,000 years ago. I mean, is it wrong to be rich now? Or another way to look at it, maybe he was talking to the rich rulers of his day, the rulers of this old covenant system. And when he's talking about their garments being moth-eaten, I don't think he's talking about the actual clothing that they're wearing, I think, what if he's talking about the temple? The temple was their clothing. It was what kept them from being naked before God. It was just like Adam and Eve were clothed with the fig leaves, and then God came along and he killed an animal and he clothed them with the skins. And now here we have this tabernacle and temple system where sacrifices are offered. They become the clothing of our to cover our sins. And he says, James says, your riches have rotted and your garments, your clothing are moth eaten. Remember how rich the religious leaders of, remember Jesus going in and cleansing the temple and turning the tables over and saying, this should be a house of prayer. You've turned it into a den of robbers, because they were getting rich off of this old covenant system. And James is saying, your riches have rotted. This temple, it's no longer covering you. It's no longer covering your sins. What if this is the wearing out of Daniel? The same wearing out. The old covenant is wearing out. 2 Corinthians 4:16. Let's look at that. Sorry, sometimes it takes me a minute. Here we go. Okay. So we do not lose heart. Though our outer self is wasting away, our inner self is being renewed day by day. For this light momentary affliction is preparing for us an eternal weight of glory beyond all comparison, as we look not to things that are seen, but to things that are unseen. For things that are seen are transient, but things that are unseen are eternal. Remember, he says our outer self is wasting away, like wearing out on the outside, but our inner self is being renewed day by day. How was their inner self being renewed day by day? Because they were clothed in Christ's righteousness. They had faith in this new covenant clothing that wasn't wearing out. It kind of harkens back to the wilderness wandering. Remember when the Jews came out of Egypt, Israel came out of Egypt, and they were in the wilderness for 40 years wandering. And when they're looking back on this, Moses is reminding them that their clothing didn't wear out. Their sandals didn't wear out. Something miraculous happened through that period. And I think that same miraculous thing was happening in the second Exodus. But just like everything else, in the first Exodus, it had to do with something physical, of physical clothing, physical sandals. In the second Exodus, the reality was spiritual. It wasn't about these physical, fleshly, earthly things. It was a bigger reality. It was their covering, their spiritual covering was being renewed day by day. And then he says, for we know that if the tent that is our earthly home, what tent is he talking about here? Well, I'm going to suggest that maybe he's talking about the temple, right? The temple. He had just been talking to them about things that are seen. What are the things that were seen? They looked up and they saw the temple. That was the thing that was seen. But he says, we know that if the tent that is our earthly home is destroyed, now, why would he think that the temple, this beautiful earthly temple where the priests had been offering their sacrifices for hundreds of years, why would he think that was going to be destroyed? Why would he say that? Well, that same word for destroyed, katalau, I don't really know how to pronounce it, but it's in Matthew 24:2, referring to the destruction of Jerusalem. This is exactly what Jesus had predicted in Matthew 23 and Matthew 24. He had predicted the end of this old covenant temple sacrificial system. And so Paul says, we know if the tent, meaning the temple, that is our earthly home, is destroyed, we have a building from God, a house not made with hands, eternal in the heavens. This is the heavenly Jerusalem of the book of Hebrews when he says, you have come to Mount Zion, the heavenly city, right? It wasn't anymore this physical earthly city. They weren't all gathered around a mountain. They were spiritually gathered to the new covenant. And it says, for in this tent we groan. How were they groaning in the tent or the temple of the old covenant? Well, the same way that they were groaning in Egypt. Remember, in Egypt, they were slaves. They had to work. And here we come to the New Testament, and Jesus is saying, and Paul is saying, you are slaves under the law. This law has made you slaves. And he says, Jesus says, come to me, for my yoke is easy and my burden is light. So they were groaning in the physical temple, old covenantal system, longing to put on our heavenly dwelling. What's the heavenly dwelling? Well, it's made of a cornerstone. And we know that that cornerstone is Christ. And we are all being built up as a spiritual house. Remember that? That is the heavenly dwelling. It's not made of physical stones. It's spiritual. If indeed by putting it on, we may not be found naked. So when we put on Christ's righteousness, we're not found naked. For while we are still in this tent, meaning the old covenant temple tent, we groan, just like they groaned in Egypt, slavery to the law, slavery to the old covenant, being burdened, not that we would be unclothed. He doesn't want to be naked. He says he doesn't want to just remove the old covenant and not put anything else on, but that we would be further clothed with something better, clothed with Christ, with the new covenant, so that what is mortal may be swallowed up by life. Well, that's kind of funny. It says something about death being swallowed up. When is death swallowed up? When is death defeated? According to 1 Corinthians 15, it's when the law, the power of sin is the law. So when the law ends, death is destroyed. The mortal is swallowed up by life. Okay, wow, that was a long little rant there, all just about the wearing out of this garment. And I'm sorry, but I felt like he missed it. He missed the whole point of the wearing out. Remember, another thing this reminds me of is in Revelation when the bride is coming down and she's clothed in her beautiful garments. This is the righteousness of Christ. It's beautiful, it's white, it's fresh, and we are the bride. We're clothed in these garments. We've put off these moth-eaten garments of the old covenant that were temporary and that were fading away. So, okay. I did want to mention, this is going to be so long. Speaking of 666 and gematria, what if it's not about gematria at all? I mean, I don't know if I had this in here, but, if we just look to the Bible, instead of trying to play our number games, there are a couple other places where 666 is mentioned in the Bible. Well, one of them is Solomon. During the reign of Solomon, I think it says that he got 666 talents of gold or something, kind of like his tax. So there's that. But remember, this mark is found on their head and on their hand. And I don't know if I wrote this in here, but that takes us back, it should remind us, I think, of Deuteronomy 18. Let me see if I wrote it down. Oh yeah, Deuteronomy 11:18. So let's go there really quick. Okay, you shall therefore lay up these words. These are the words of the law. okay? These words of mine in your heart and in your soul, and you shall bind them as a sign on your hand, and they shall be as frontlets between your eyes. On your hand, between your eyes. This is the same as the mark of the beast from the book of Revelation, on the forehead and the hands. So just something to think about there. Maybe a different way to interpret it rather than gematria, playing the numbers game. But that's for a whole nother video. So, okay, we're going to have to move fast. I knew this was going to be long, but I didn't know it was going to be this long. Okay, he talks about this person is going to blaspheme. He gets that from 2 Thessalonians again, even though we've established that 2 Thessalonians actually has a very first century context, but okay. He says that this person is going to oppose and exalt himself above all that is God, so that he sits as God in the temple of God, showing himself that he is God. This is where we get the idea that we need to rebuild the temple in Jerusalem again, a third temple, because we need a temple for the Antichrist to sit in and pretend to be God. Unless we accept all the time statements we've already read. For example, when John said, this is the last hour, and this is how we know it's the last hour, the Antichrist has come. Many Antichrists have come, and by this we know it's the last hour. So if that's the case, there was already a temple standing during that time. So whoever this person is, could it be that he already did this in the second temple before the second temple was destroyed, and we don't need a third temple? I'm going to say yes, and maybe at the end I'll tell you about that. So, okay, let's see, what else does he have to say about this Antichrist? The program of the coming world leader. He says that the Antichrist will be killed. Okay, the Antichrist is going to come out of the European Union. He's going to be killed, but to the astonishment of all the world, he will be raised back to life by the power of Satan. Okay, after his death and satanic resurrection, the Antichrist will assassinate the leaders of 3 of the countries in the European Union, and other nations will immediately relinquish their power to him. On and on. I mean, first of all, he really is dead set on this European Union thing, which I think should be a sign to people that maybe he's a little off here. But also, he says that there will be a satanic resurrection of the Antichrist, which we've already talked about how the beast and the Antichrist are not the same thing. So, you know, there's a big problem right from the get-go. But another question is, can Satan resurrect? Can there be a satanic resurrection? Isn't that what made Jesus's resurrection special? I mean, because it's from God. Satan, I can't imagine anyone believing that Satan has the power to make the dead live. It seems to me only God can bring life. That isn't a power of Satan. If it is, he would be equal with God, wouldn't he? So, I don't know. Let me know in the comments about that. Oh, and then he talks about the mark and how it could be like these radio frequency chips that they're going to implant in us, which he thought was really new technology back in 2008, but, you know, we've moved on from there. I put, like, as a funny little thing, or it could be vaccines, or it could be masks. I remember just a few years ago when people were saying that. So, and then he brings up remember the mark. We read about the mark in Deuteronomy. So go back and read about that and think about it a little. Let me know if that leads to any different conclusions for you. But he talks about the abomination of desolation. Okay, I guess he's saying that the abomination of desolation is the Antichrist, which is this leader that comes out of the European Union. But remember, the abomination of desolation that's mentioned in the book of Matthew is referred to by Luke as when Jerusalem is surrounded by armies. And do you know when Jerusalem was surrounded by armies? In the 1st century. So yet again, we have another time statement that's leading us back to this already happened in the 1st century. Maybe this is shocking to you, but I mean, people have been predicting this Antichrist is in this generation for 10 generations or more. So shouldn't we start questioning whether that is the right interpretation, or are we just going to keep buying it hook, line, and sinker? And then at the end of all this, okay, he says, the victorious Christ will assume his throne as rightful king and ruler of the universe. This bothers me, and it always bothered me. Is Christ on his throne or is he not? Because according to Dr. David Jeremiah, he is not yet on his throne. So he has ascended to heaven. He's not on his throne yet after 2,000 years. I wrote, is he weak or impotent? Why has he not sat on the throne as the rightful king and ruler of the universe? So I think I did a video, the benefits of preterism. I should have put this, or maybe I did, I can't even remember what I said, but one of the benefits of preterism is that you understand that Christ is on his throne right now, ruling and reigning, and you don't have to be waiting for it in the future. He's already ruling and reigning right now. So, okay, and then the last words of the chapter, he says, keep looking up. That made me laugh. I put a little smiley face next to that. Keep looking up. Well, people have been looking up for the last 2,000 years, waiting for Jesus to come riding on his My Little Pony on a cloud like a Care Bear with a sword and fire coming out of his mouth and all the things. And according to David Jeremiah, it hasn't happened, and we need to just keep looking. And we're probably going to die, just statistically speaking, judging from the past. You know, generations come, generations go. It hasn't happened, so it's probably not going to happen to us. We're just all dying, and yet Christ has delayed his return, and he's not ruling and reigning, according to Dr. Jeremiah. But I disagree. I think that he is ruling and reigning, and if you want to know who I think the Antichrist was, or the man of lawlessness from 2 Thessalonians, I think it would be helpful for you if you read Josephus's War of the Jews. It's about the rebellion that occurred in the 1st century when the Jews decided that they wanted to break free from Roman rule and establish their kingdom on earth. Jesus offered them a kingdom, but he was offering a spiritual kingdom. They didn't want that. They rejected him. Remember, they rejected him. Remember, what's the Antichrist? If you deny Christ, they denied Christ. They denied he was the Messiah. They rejected him in favor of an earthly kingdom. And they went about setting up, or attempting to set up, that earthly kingdom in the 1st century. And in doing so, they destroy themselves from the inside out. A lot of people would say that Rome destroyed Israel and destroyed Jerusalem, which is partly true, but if you really read Josephus's account of the war, you'll understand that the Jews had already destroyed themselves from the inside before the Romans got in. And by the time the Romans got into the city, which, by the way, I forgot to point out that David Jeremiah says this Antichrist is going to rule for 3.5 years. Well, it's just a coincidence that the war with Rome, the Jewish war against Rome, lasted 3.5 years. I'm sure that's a coincidence. But after this 3.5 year war and a 5-month siege and famine and, starvation and treachery within, by the time the Romans got into the city of Jerusalem, it was a mess. The people walking around were hardly human. They were like zombies. Most of them were dead, putrefied bodies everywhere. It was a shell. So who's the Antichrist? Well, there is, according to Josephus's account of this war, a person named Eleazar ben Ananias. I think it's Ananias. I don't know if it's Ananias or Ananias. But he actually was one of the zealot leaders, and he took control of the temple itself, and he set up his headquarters in the temple itself. He set up a phony fake high priest. He went into the Holy of Holies. They drank out of the sacred vessels. He made a mockery of it, complete debauchery in the temple. And, I was thinking about this today when it says that this man of lawlessness will set himself up in the temple, proclaiming himself to be God. I used to think that meant that he was going to stand in the temple and say, I am God. And I don't know that anyone records that ever happening, but what if it means that by placing yourself in the temple, you are declaring yourself to be God just by your presence there? Because remember, when the tabernacle was made and they placed the ark in there and the wings of the cherubim over spread the ark, and then it says the glory of the Lord filled it, and he said, I will dwell here above the ark. It was his throne. The ark was his throne. And although we don't have any evidence that the ark was even in the second temple, I think it had been taken by Babylon. I don't know what happened to it, but there's no evidence it was in the temple in Jerusalem in the 1st century, called Herod's temple. And yet this Eleazar, he placed himself in the Holy of Holies. That in and of itself was a declaration of being God. Possibly. So he's definitely a candidate. But whoever the Antichrist is or was, remember, he's not mentioned in the book of Revelation, and he was already present in the 1st century according to John. So unless he's 2,000 plus years old, he's not in our future, he's in our past. And that's great news, because you don't have to be afraid of him coming in the future. This Antichrist was not about the end of the world. Why am I a heretic? Because I don't believe that all of this talk about the Antichrist and the apocalypse and Armageddon and all that has anything to do with our future and a future end of the world. It has everything to do with our past and what I was talking about this transformation from the old covenant to the new covenant, the old covenant to the new covenant. So that happened in the 1st century. If it didn't happen in the 1st century, think about the ramifications. We would still be living under the old covenant. And if we're still living under the old covenant, there is no hope for us at all, because we don't even have a temple, we don't have priests, we don't have animal sacrifices, and we never could, because we can't find a priest, because how could we ever prove someone's a Levite? There's no genealogies. No. This is about a transformation from something that was growing old and wearing out and about to vanish away, from that into the new covenant. And it was an apocalypse for them. If you lived in Jerusalem, if you lived anywhere in Israel, it was a horrible, horrible apocalypse. It was a judgment on the old covenant, and the Christians were spared. You can read about that at other places. So yeah, I don't know. That's all I have. Let's see what's coming up next. The new axis of evil, chapter 8. So I don't know what that will be. He's talking about the United Nations. I don't know. We'll probably just go through that fast, because I think we'd be beating a dead horse to continue on with this. And then chapter 9 is arming for Armageddon. Well, I already gave away what I thought about that. So anyway, I'm going on a vacation, so I don't know. It's really hard for me to make these, but I don't know when I'll see you, but I'll see you when I see you. So bye.